I would say, remember that food scraps in the garbage are the problem, and food scraps making compost is the solution. And it's a solution because compost is nature's fertilizer, it's nature's vitamin. It's making more soil, essentially. So it's like, think of it as you either put food scraps in a landfill where they rot and can't decompose properly and are in this like horrible dungeon with all these weird neighbors of like computer chips and plastic bottle caps and just, whatever else, just this hellhole of the other side of our modern life that nobody wants to look at. Like, food scraps don't belong there because food scraps have value. They have all these nutrients in them that want to go back into the earth. And so all we have to do is like liberate food scraps to live their best life and become compost and return into soil again to continue the cycle of life.
Welcome to Animalia, where we cover all things conservation, climate justice, and sustainability. If you're currently not a composter yourself or composting by any curbside pickup, don't worry, you're not alone. In fact, 75% of U.S. households currently do not have access to curbside composting, meaning their cities or towns are not providing compost bins and pickups. And given most people don't have the space to compost themselves, or worry it may be too much effort, an overwhelming majority of Americans today are not composting at all. And that's not good, because as we're going to learn today, composting really matters. It's one of the most important tools in our arsenal for fighting climate change and improving our lives. We throw away a whopping 40% of our food here today in the US. Consider that 1 in 4 children in this country go hungry. And for the purpose of this episode, all of that food waste could be used instead to make critical, nutrient-rich soil. Instead, we send it to landfills. And at the landfill, it gets mixed in with non-degradable products and a plethora of chemicals instead of being turned into soil. And it contributes to our growing waste crisis. And waste produces methane gas. In fact, a shocking 25% of our methane gas output comes from waste. And methane gas traps heat in our atmosphere at a rate 25 times that of carbon. So yeah, this is a problem. And the solution has been well known and well understood for centuries. Composting. So why then isn't it more widespread? And how do we make it more accessible? Joining me today are 3 incredible Compost Commandos! The first is Lauren Turk, a leader at Farah Zero, who is determined to solve our waste problem and identifies composting as one of, if not the most important tool in doing so. Next, Charlie Pioli, founder of O-Town Compost, one of the best examples yet of a successful private composting business operating in Orlando, Florida. Charlie also has a great podcast of his own dedicated to all things composting, and we'll link to that in the episode. Please check it out, subscribe, and leave his podcast a great review. Finally, Dr. Lee Reich, who I like to think of as the OG of composting, an avid farm dinner, as he likes to put it, that's bigger than a garden, but smaller than a farm, who has been writing books and teaching courses in composting work and gardening overall for over 50 years. If you ever had any questions about composting, why it's so important, and how you can get involved yourself, this is the episode for you. If you haven't had a chance yet to watch the renowned documentary on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, you should. If you have, well, then you know the vital role soil plays in protecting this planet. Soil is the lifeblood of our entire food supply. It quite literally keeps us alive, along with everything else on this planet. It also serves as an incredible carbon sink. There are over 2,500 gigatons of carbon stored in soil. A gigaton. Yeah, I had to look that up too. A gigaton is 1 billion metric tons. That's a lot. Let's make that feel a bit more tangible. In 2020, at a global level, we released roughly 36 billion tons of carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Actually, a 7% decline from 2019 due to the COVID shutdown. So at that rate, currently our soil is sequestering 70 years worth of carbon emissions at our current peak levels. Thank you, soil. So healthy soil is really, really important. Yet we've been doing our best to destroy it.
It's like, well, what really happens when soil like blows away, basically? What really happens when it can't store water? What really happens when it doesn't absorb any CO2? Well, on the CO2 front, that, as we know, that means that there's more CO2 hanging out in the air. And that's not good. On the water front, well, it means that an area that soil, like, it's more susceptible, it's more vulnerable to drought, fire, and flood, basically. It's like a disruption of weather patterns. So if that land doesn't have water underneath it to keep the plants and everything healthy, then it's more likely that that land will be degraded from drought. It's more likely that that land is really dry, and if a fire comes, that it'll get, swept up in that fire, and that if a flood comes, that the water can't be absorbed, but it just sits on top. So as it relates to natural disasters, compost is relevant there as well. So it's really crazy how important it is and what we could accomplish to improve, to improve climate catastrophe outcomes, frankly, if we were to really lean into it.
That's Lauren, who I'm going to give the superhero name of the Marvelous Soil Maven. Because as a reminder, these are the Compost Commandos!
We have a soil health crisis. Not everybody is aware of it or talking about it, but lots is happening at the legislative level to deal with this. Basically, after World War II, we had all of this extra nitrogen chemical left over, and we used that to make fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen as a fertilizer, which was a huge part in how we recovered in many ways and fed lots of people for a long time and had a booming agriculture industry. But the problem is we used a very economy of scale industrialization mentality. And basically when you put synthetic fertilizers on soil, it doesn't actually add anything back into the soil. The soil over time becomes bereft of its nutrients and of its structure. So kind of think of it like, I'll use a more PG example. Think of it like giving somebody coffee but never letting them sleep. It's like you can make it for a while. Like you'll stay awake, maybe you'll have some great insights at work or whatever from your coffee buzz, but you're going to crash eventually. And that's basically what we've done to our soils by over applying for a really long time synthetic fertilizers. What also happens is that the over application of synthetic fertilizers runs off into our waterways when it rains. And this is what produces dead zones in the oceans, if you've heard about them, and algae blooms. So there's all this stuff that's out of balance, and that's being harmed by essentially using chemicals instead of making compost.
That's not all the problems post-World War II life brought us. The waste industry also really changed at that time. The era of disposable everything was ushered in with monumental growth of one of Earth's true mortal enemies, single-use plastics. The focus was on sanitation, not the environment, and disposable products led the way. Given that composting and the benefits of it have been around for so long, why do you think we've just been throwing away food waste when we know the science has been sitting there, but we've never really embraced it at scale?
Yeah, I think you have to look back to the history of the waste industry in this country. And to give you a timeline, prior to World War II, there were just most of the material, there wasn't plastics or, nylon, these really pretty modern materials. And as far as disposal went, most people were composting at that time in their backyard. There were like dumps that were just like not permitted at that time. They were just like farms, or people would even dump into lakes, just in the woods. And then fast forward to post World War II. Like World War II is responsible for engineering all these new materials like plastic, nylon parachutes. I think I'm forgetting some others, but the post-consumer, like the consumer era after World War II, is when the waste really got real, and people started to generate significant amounts of waste, and the old disposal system of these, illegal dumps were not working very well, and it was just really polluting the environment. Air emissions from the vehicles was getting bad. And that's why the EPA and the Clean Air Act were formed, I think, in 1970-ish. But after that happened, sanitary landfills became the regulation. And, they did a good job at being sanitary. And it was like a public health crisis at that point. But along with that came some waste haulers like Waste Management, who began to consolidate over the next 30 years and buy little waste haulers. Back in like the early part of the 1900s, a waste hauler might just have like one neighborhood. Like it was very decentralized, and anyone with a truck could be picking up garbage or waste. And then, the big haulers began to consolidate. That's even happening today. Like Waste Management just bought Advanced Disposal, which is another giant hauler. And recycling came into being around 1970. And I won't go into plastics recycling, but basically the whole waste industry has been heading towards this efficiency and maximization of like profits and vertical integration. Like our big waste haulers today that handle a lot of the materials, they're traded on Wall Street. So they're kind of looking at like, how can we maximize efficiency? And by maximizing efficiency, that means like single stream recycling is a perfect example. We just throw all the recyclables into one bin. We don't have to have like dual hoppers in our truck. We have the automatic arm come out, dump, and we take it to the nearest centralized recycling facility. That's why community composting is awesome, because it's very decentralized. You might have like LA Compost in Los Angeles might have a bunch of composting hubs and sites around the city. And, for a city like LA or LA County, it's a giant region. It would just be like ridiculous to, be hauling food waste across the county, and it would kind of lose the environmental benefit of doing that.
And that was Charlie, also known around here as Dr. O. In all my time doing these podcasts, World War II always seems to be an interesting inflection point in our history. You might recall this was also the time period where, once we mastered monoculture farming and built a massive wheat abundance, our government quite literally made up a food pyramid out of economic need, not nutrition or science, with wheat occupying the base and recommending we eat it 6 to 10 times a day. Hello, diabetes. And this is still taught to kids today. It's insane. We were so focused on economic growth and moving Americans into the middle class. And by and large, we did a pretty damn good job of that. But we had no idea the problems all these industrial systems designed for pure scale and efficiency would lead to. Now, we're all paying the price. And especially marginalized lower income people, who never got to benefit really much at all from the very system causing all these problems that they have to pay for. Okay, that's a rabbit hole of frustration, so I'm going to get back to composting. So we've established that we have a pretty bad and real soil health crisis. Now, we also have a waste crisis. We produce nearly 250 million tons of waste every year here in the US. That works out to 1,700 pounds per person. That is far and away more than any other country in the world. American consumerism at its finest. And a big chunk of that is food waste. As we mentioned at the top of the episode, we throw 40% of our food away. We spend $218 billion in resources, time, labor, transportation, disposal of the food we're throwing away. We just toss it to landfills.
To me, that's I find that totally repulsive. I find the whole idea of landfills to be really disrespectful to this, and I truly mean this, disrespectful to the soil, because the soil is basically a thin skin over the earth that supports, much of the life here, and to just, it's not even landfills, say from 200 years ago, that was just, if they had them then, they would just put organic matter in and cover it up, and it's sort of, putrefy, but eventually it would become some organic material, a changed organic material. But now, they line it with something so nothing leaches out, and then all the garbage comes in plastic bags, and then it's filled and lined again. I mean, it's really just like it's a storage place. It's like storing nuclear waste. It's just taking up space of land, which is a great resource. It's something we have for free.
And that's Dr. Lee, also known as the Farmdener. Well, he sort of made our superhero naming process quite easy, given he gave himself that name. So we have a soil crisis, and we have a waste crisis. If only there was a magic elixir that could help solve both of these. Composting.
Compost is magic. Food scraps and garbage is hell.
This is the easiest magic trick you'll ever perform. For many, the idea of composting sounds hard, laborious, and kind of dirty. Now, yeah, you can get dirty, but there's actually some really interesting studies that show any form of backyard gardening, including composting, is really, really good for your mental health. Healthy soil has this rejuvenating quality for all life forms, from microbes to people. But it's actually not all that hard or laborious either. Quite the opposite.
Well, I think it's partially because people who write about it sometimes make it sound more complicated than it is. I think on the one hand, humans seem to have this desire to complicate things that needn't be, and then other people could be put off by that. A good example is, this is probably a touchy subject with some people, not necessarily with you, but who would hear, compost tea. So people like going through all this machinations about, how to make compost tea, and you spread on the ground. I mean, you just make compost, you put it on the ground. It's simple. I guess people for some reason think it's more complicated than it is. And if it was conveyed, that's why whenever I give a workshop, I say, it will become compost no matter what you do. Just get a bin so it doesn't look like a garbage pile. Do it, and you get compost. But a lot of people say, you got to balance out the carbon and the browns and the greens, and then people wonder, well, how much do I have to do? If you have extra of one or the other, it'll still become compost. And if you get interested in it, because I think it's a fascinating process, if you get interested, you just pay attention to what you did. Maybe you monitor with a thermometer, and then you change it a little each time, and it's fascinating. It's like having this pet that you're just feeding, and it's always going to be healthy and happy, but you can change it a little.
Many folks also struggle to identify exactly what they can compost versus not compost. But we overthink this as well. Nearly all organic waste is compostable. Sure, different things compost at different rates. Fatty substances like oil or grease can take much longer and need sometimes certain composting parameters, and you should avoid any chemical irritants or additives. But for the most part, anything you can eat can turn back into incredibly healthy soil instead of going to a landfill.
I focus more on, small farms and home gardens, and just say teaching people that they can compost basically any organic waste, basically. It makes me sort of laugh when, even from extension publications, I read this, where they'll say, well, when you put stuff in the compost, if you have something that's diseased or has insects on it, some garden plant, seal it in a plastic bag and throw it out. And I tell people that's like, I mean, for ever since I started composting, there's nothing I will not put in my compost. That's one thing. So just empirically, that has worked. And the other thing is that if you look at any part of a plant, unless it's been doused with an enormous amount of pesticides, there's going to be something on it that some pest or some insect that you didn't want or some disease speck somewhere. You just put it all in the compost. And, I guess that's another thing that makes people nervous. Can I, because a lot of times people send me questions and they'll say, oh, can I compost this? What should I do with this? So, yeah.
And there are tons of benefits. We've already outlined many of them, ranging from eliminating waste to producing healthy soil to our own mental health. It even helps mitigate soil erosion, another big problem we have.
Compost not only offers nutrients, but compost acts as this helper to get the soil back into shape. Think of it as a personal trainer for soil. Soil is alive and soil has a structure. And when that structure and shape is healthy, that's what actually allows that soil to store carbon, to store water. And that's really relevant because soil that can absorb water when it rains, that's what builds our water table, right? And when you're in periods of drought or, just in between rains, plants and such need to be able to pull from the reserves in the soil to actually, have enough water access. And so basically, if you have soil that has lost its structure and doesn't have any nutrients in it, it's essentially dead and it blows away or gets washed away when it rains. And this is what we call erosion. And so right now we're actually losing billions and billions of tons of soil every year that just blows away with the wind or gets washed away with the rain. And a terrible fact is that we're actually losing more soil than during the Dust Bowl era by a factor of 2. So twice as much soil is eroding right now than during the Dust Bowl. And, maybe you've seen pictures of just dusty areas and all this stuff blowing around. That's what's happening right now.
Scientists estimate that here in the US, we're losing soil at a rate 10 times faster than we're able to replenish it. This is going to dramatically hurt our ability to grow and produce food in the coming decades. Toss in more droughts and heat waves on top of that, and we're back to that soil crisis Lauren has been talking about. And while there are important innovations happening, such as vertical farming, that can help shift how we produce some of our crops, that is far from a silver bullet solution, and has its own limitations and challenges ahead. We tackled some of that in a previous episode with Bowery farming. So if composting is such a great solution to these really large problems, why isn't it more widespread? A lot of people think of composting as if I don't have a yard, I don't have space. And, we know in this country, a majority of people don't have yards. They don't have personal outdoor space. That's a larger issue that has mental health challenges and a number of other things. And it's only getting worse because of the income gap in this country is getting wider and wider, not narrower. But because most people don't have yards and outdoor space, they think I can't compost. So they kind of, what can I do? This is for people with yards and lawnmowers and all the, what like the white picket fence. A lot of people think of that house is where you can compost. So how do we debunk that, and how do we kind of change it? And what can people do that maybe only have a outdoor patio, or they have a, maybe a patio on the 7th floor of an apartment building, or they're in a, dense urban area? How do we get composting to those people?
Right. That is literally the problem I and my colleagues at Farah Zero are working to solve. It's really frustrating that 75% of American households don't have any curbside organics collection. So that's from the city. I don't think that number is going to budge very quickly. And to fill in the gaps then, as you're saying, a lot of people live in apartment buildings who don't have yards, etc. Okay, what do we do? I mean, in order to address that, we need to have more community compost organizations and efforts, and we need to have more green spaces that are hyper-local, that are, within walking distance to people's homes, so that if you want to compost, it's not a big deal for you to do so, that there's a garden that is nearby that you can bring your food scraps to, or there's like a micro hauler, they call it, little collection service. There's lots of kind of cool organizations in Detroit, in Portland, in the Bay, in Brooklyn, in Chicago. They're popping up all over the place of folks who are essentially a community initiative or nonprofit who declare a space, a green space and composting space, and then get people to sign up to either have their compost collected or to drop it off at that location. And then you keep your nutrients local and you're creating soil that you can then use. And that to me is super exciting because it's all about community and it's all about co-benefits. And you mentioned earlier in this conversation that, access to green space is intersectional with environmental justice and mental health, right? And so we need to advocate to have more green spaces in every neighborhood. And as we do that, it's really obvious to me that we ought to have not only places to compost, but places to have gardens, urban gardens, if there's people who want to grow their own food as well. So what we're doing at Farah is we're launching an app. Well, we already launched an app last year, but we're sort of like sprucing it up to make a really public version that's coming out July 16th. And essentially it's an app where you can find all of the ways and places that you can compost in your neighborhood. And we also track your impact. So every time that you bring food scraps to be composted, there's a positive environmental footprint of that we keep track of and then like celebrate for you in an impact stat dashboard. So we're really excited about it. We did our pilot in Los Angeles last year, and Los Angeles is a great example of where things are really popping when it comes to compost. There's this amazing nonprofit called LA Compost, and they've been declaring compost spaces for years. And they have two kind of formats. One is they put these spaces at like a school or at a community garden, and that's really great. But there's a limit to it because only so many people can belong to their locations due to volume of how much compost a particular space can collect. And so to make up for that and to open it up to more people, LA Compost started collecting food scraps at farmers markets, which I think is really brilliant. And what I noticed was they weren't keeping track of like how much they were collecting and who was coming and how much people were bringing and all of that stuff. And I looked at that and I was like, there's a missed opportunity here, because I think if people knew the impact they were having on the planet and on their city by this simple act of bringing their food scraps to LA Compost while they shop instead of putting it in the garbage can, like I think more people would do it. And so, I built this very simple app to essentially track impact, right? Not only for people, but for LA Compost. And it turns out it was very popular. People got really excited about their impact, and participation increased by 48% in just 6 months. And this, mind you, was during the pandemic. So it's like, talk about incredible. And so that was really exciting. And so then we were like, okay, I think we're onto something here. And then basically just friends of mine connected me with some other compost organizations and regenerative farms in Hawaii who also want to use Farah to track the impact of composting. And so we're just expanding. And we realized that it would be really valuable to people if there was an app where they could just find how and where and why to compost and be able to track the impact of their composting. And so that's what we're doing.
We could think of composting across 3 different layers. Number 1, the personal or backyard composting, which is great and widely encouraged, but of course has accessibility and scalability limitations. Still, we need more of this. Number 2, community or co-op composting. This is along the lines of what Lauren mentioned, where we need to create more community green spaces and make composting a big part of them. allowing folks to come in to both contribute organic scraps and utilize the healthy soil in gardens. And number 3, large-scale city or neighborhood-wide composting. This includes both city-run public programs. You might have a citywide curbside program in your city. Also private enterprises such as Charlie's, O-Town Compost, and future public-private partnerships. This usually involves some form of curbside pickup. In discussing composting with all 3 of these experts, it dawned on me that it felt obvious that composting can pay for itself. After all, it reduces waste, which reduces costs, and it can be turned into healthy soil, which can be sold to farmers and growers. So why aren't more cities embracing this if this critical environmental endeavor can actually pay for itself?
Now, why isn't that happening? You are right, James, that it should pay for itself over time. And part of what is really exciting to me is like what Farah Zero is, Farah Zero is collecting all these stats on how much food scraps we're collecting, which is like how much we're diverting from landfills. And that's really important for solving this problem with cities, because when we have that number of this many tons so I'll just use the LA compost example. We've collected 150 tons of food scraps. And that means that the city of LA has not paid a tipping fee, which is it's a fee that you pay by weight to dump a garbage can's load into a landfill. So we've saved the city of LA the fee of 150 tons of food scraps. So it's indisputable that they are saving money from this. Now, if they were to spin up their own collection service, they'd have to pay people, to do the collection, It would still save them money. However, the reason this hasn't happened, and this gets really political and regulatory environments become very relevant, basically, there's a lot of red tape around constructing an industrial facility. It has to be a certain distance outside the city. It takes like 5 to 7 years to get the permitting. And it's like many, many millions of dollars to construct it and time. And so, unfortunately, what we've seen is that the state of California has really progressive goals around waste diversion. I think it's like 95% goal of diverting waste by 2050. But in a city like LA, well, basically there's these franchise contracts with waste haulers, which means only certain haulers are allowed legally to go collect garbage or recycling or compost if they were to choose. So that narrows down the decision-making power to just a couple of people. And so those couple of people get to decide whether it makes more sense for them in their business based on profit to start a composting service. And basically, because it's millions of dollars and it's 5 to 7 years of permitting to spin up a composting program, they have effectively decided to pay the fines for not meeting the diversion goals stated by the state of California because they're cheaper and easier than it is to change things. So that's why when I looked at this, I was like, well, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and do what I can do and really support what I'm seeing that is working. And I want to prove just how amazing community compost organizations like LA Compost are by being armed with data and telling stories with that data, because then I can turn around and talk with different decision makers and stakeholders and be like, there's no reason for you not to support more hyper-local, community-centered composting, because there's all of these co-benefits of green spaces in communities. People are keeping their food scraps and waste streams local with compost. It's saving you money. People are coming together. Everybody's happy. Like, it's a no-brainer, basically. And then the second thing that I want to address from your question is, like, couldn't cities sell the compost that they make to farms? Well, a good place to look for how that works would be the city of San Francisco, which is maybe one of the most successful citywide composting programs in the country. And if you were to talk to farmers in the area, they would tell you that they don't really want to buy the quote unquote compost from the city of San Francisco. And that has to do with contamination. And this is really a problem for the design of curbside collection, because as soon as you put a bin outside of an apartment complex or outside of a household, that bin is not accounted for. Anything that goes into that bin is anonymized. And so there's basically like no accountability for what goes into that bin. And that means that there's high levels, there could be high levels of contamination going into a composting facility, which means that what's coming out of it might not be as good for soil as we would hope. And sometimes, you could picture that being like a drunk person putting a beer can in there, or somebody who doesn't know it's a compost bin putting cat litter in there. Those things are part of the problem, but also as part of the problem are like the materials, substances in a lot of our in a lot of the things we interact with on a daily basis. So like pesticides, chemicals, even materials that are quote unquote compostable. Most of them have what are called for short PFAs in them, which are called, like, people call them forever chemicals, because they're essentially chemicals that allow for the material to stay stable, but they're really not things that you want in your compost because they're not natural and they're not good for you, and that goes into the plants, and it's just more bad stuff. So contamination.
Which brings us back to Charlie. Dr. O. If composting can be revenue positive, and there's too much red tape and legacy bureaucracy for many cities to tackle this, well, this seems ripe for private enterprise. Charlie's business is one such example, a for-profit composting service that currently serves the Orlando area. As Dr. O explains, this was an easy business to bootstrapping it off the ground in a lean way. As he grew wider and moved into the commercial end of organic waste, that's when challenges showed up, but nothing he couldn't solve.
Just from the very origin, it's a very easy business to bootstrap. All it takes is a vehicle or even a bicycle, depending on your community. And, you can just buy a couple 5-gallon buckets and swap them out for neighbors. And, even after our 5th subscriber, I would say I personally didn't hire someone until maybe a year into the business, when we already had, 120 subscribers. And I felt like I needed a driver to come in and start doing the routes so I could focus on growing the business. But it is profitable, at the beginning it is profitable, but not you're not raking in the dough. Mm-hmm. And as now we're kind of at a crux where we're looking at taking on more commercial clients, because the residential side is very easy. It's, the average subscriber of ours generates maybe 11 pounds of food scraps per week. You could even do that in your backyard compost pile sometimes. But the commercial side are the restaurants, the institutions like universities, cafes, like the heavier food waste generators. And I wouldn't recommend that to other community composters to just go after them unless your composting process is set up for that, and your vehicles, like your collection, is set up for that.
His solution is to be truly vertically integrated, from collection through composting through distribution of soil.
Unfortunately, here in Orlando, there were no other composting sites around town. The infrastructure wasn't there, so I could just focus on the collection side and haul it to the composting site, then wipe my hands and be done with it. But, I guess you'd say we're vertically integrated, where we do the processing as well as the collection.
Is there an advantage to that in the sense that A, you have more control to make sure the composting is done right, and B, you can then sell that soil?
Yeah, exactly. We do have more control, and, we are able to communicate directly to our clients if there is contamination, because Traditionally, if you're only on the composting site, processing side, you wouldn't really have any control getting in contamination from the collector. But also we can, refine our product and, really put the compost in O-Town compost and tell the whole story. I think it's two separate businesses though, and I highly recommend to community composters to make sure that the infrastructure is there before you start picking up food scraps.
That vertical integration allows you to control for issues along the way. One of the big ones at composting is contamination, essentially when non-compostable material gets mixed in with organic matter. This can be expensive and costly to remove once scraps arrive at a larger industrial composting center, which is why Charlie thinks being vertically integrated is so important. By having a relationship with his customers directly, he can educate them on what it means to properly compost. And he can take measures with commercial folks as well, such as selling them biodegradable gloves, which are the main culprits for contamination on the commercial end of things.
I would say the residential customers is completely different from commercial customers. The people who subscribe for our service, their families, their households, they're the type of people who have an idea and, they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't care. So we see less than 1% contamination on the residential side. When we do see contamination, it's usually, it's usually someone else in the household that hasn't been informed of what the bucket is there for. But when we drop off our buckets, a new subscriber subscribes, we drop off their bucket. We also include a little postcard size infographic with the yeses and nos. The commercial side, that's where the contamination is really completely different. We still manage to keep our commercial contamination, around 1% to 2% by volume. It's all plastic, so you can't measure contamination by weight. It's very lightweight. So I think I just did a training a couple weekends ago for a couple restaurants, and I try to do these trainings periodically to the kitchen staff. Probably the biggest contaminant we see are the plastic food prep gloves, which we actually sell compostable food prep gloves from EcoSafe. They're a compostable bag manufacturer. So that's one way we're trying to nip it in the bud on the commercial side. The other way to nip it in the bud is this university that just signed on. We actually have a $10 a week contamination penalty. And that really isn't a significant amount of money, but that's kind of enough money if we have to spend an extra 15 minutes picking out a ton of contamination. And we're not going to ding them unless it's egregious. But this is just kind of a incentive to keep the education going. So they're just not, thinking that when they see the invoice at the end of the month, they're paying attention.
Charlie has shown this model can work. We can create successful local composting operations that can both make money and work to address our soil and waste crises. Lauren has been eyeing to do some of the same. She's currently expanding the work with her team at Fair Zero right now down in Hawaii. But she also sees plenty of opportunity to take both the private enterprise and community green space models to many other markets. There are a couple of other things worth flagging as well that can help make composting as core to our lives as single-use plastics have been for decades. For one, we got to clean up the framework of organic and regenerative farming. I find it difficult to navigate between the two, and I study these things and talk to experts. Imagine what it's like for the average consumer. We're still classifying food as organic from what I see as legacy standards. And regenerative agriculture, which is really where we need to be, is sort of sitting out there on the fringes with no real mainstream communication strategy. This actually came up in our episode earlier this year with an executive from the Organic Center. I actually look at composting as sort of symbolic of this difference. Organic farming mostly centers around limiting the use of pesticides and additives. But it doesn't go far enough in dictating key factors such as how you are using recycling water and soil health. For example, as an organic farmer, you can augment your soil with additive nitrogen derived from manure sourced from factory farm livestock facilities. Those, of course, being the most unorganic catastrophe we have in our food production system. This is just one example of the sort of loopholes that exist in our organic standards today. So we can think of regenerative farming as prioritizing a circular methodology, where we're putting back in exactly what we take out, and there's no need to augment it with extra water, organic approved pesticides, or livestock manure. What's one way to do this? Composting.
To me, organic gardening used to be, it was almost like just don't spray pesticides or don't spray synthetic pesticides. And then, but now I've sort of refined what I consider to be organic gardening, and it's not always in sync with, the true or not true, but the legal or others definitions of organic gardening. I mean, to me, organic gardening, first of all, the organic in organic gardening is organic matter, which is carbon compounds. And this, to me, is fundamental. And this gets back to compost, because carbon is, compost is basically carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen with minerals in it. So one thing is, I think organic that's an important component. But then, over the years, more and more, I really think the environmental component is important, that you don't want to upset the environment, or you want to minimally upset it. Because anytime you change a landscape, whether it's for a farm or a garden, you're it's not a natural landscape. If it was a natural landscape, there wouldn't necessarily be food plants, say, growing in it. So that's another thing. And then one thing more in the last decade or more that I've been much more interested in is, and this relates to regenerative, and I don't really separate them out that much, because I think it's just one whole picture, and maybe there's a better term that's needed. But the regenerative, it's just, one of the other component that's really important to me is sustainability, because I think a lot of organic farming, especially, and organic gardening, it's not really sustainable in the sense that, it's a cycle that can keep going on and on. Basically, if you're mining some rock mineral in some place, and this is what's needed according to you to sustain this garden here, that's not, that to me isn't regenerative. And the beauty of the natural system is that soils will regenerate themselves generally, maybe not every type of soil, but most soils left to their own devices will regenerate themselves. So this is something, even on my scale of a farm den, I try and do as sustainable as possible. And this would be, I guess this is what regenerative means. So yeah, so I think the components are, organic matter, minimal disruption of the environment, and sustainability. I think a lot of people, and farms and gardens, organic farms and gardens, they call it organic, but then they're buying just big bags, say, of fertilizer, but it's organic fertilizers.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of loopholes.
Yeah, and if you're buying organic fertilizer, that's coming from somewhere else, and you got to bring it here. And taking something from, for this transport, but it's also you're taking something from the soil, and something has to be added there. So it really doesn't make sense to me.
Regenerative agriculture needs a communication upgrade. And one key suggestion from Lauren is doing a better job of mapping our soil health to the larger benefits and creating the right incentives.
There's a lot that's going to go into converting, and I have a bunch of dear friends in the space of regenerative ag and of mapping out basically soil health, mapping soil health and its benefits, and creating incentives around having farmers improve soil health as they farm, as opposed to doing the opposite. Just basically nobody's been paying attention to this at all until recently. And so now it's game on. You're totally on point there. It's interesting because synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is applied in a very different way than compost would be, though utilizing a compost tea is a way to kind of make it a similar application process. But it's there's training that goes into it. It's we're going to be asking people to adopt a new behavior, buy a different thing. We have to get the cost to be the same. And like synthetic fertilizer is heavily subsidized, right? And so there's all sorts of things between here and there. However, in the medium or near term, you have things like in California, the state of California passed a law. I don't remember the name of the law. It's not 1383, it's a different one. But basically they're like, okay, we are going to state that we have to use compost to regenerate fire-scarred lands. It's not the only thing that they're not mandated to only use compost, but they are mandated to use compost to regenerate fire-scarred lands. And we have more than 4 million acres of fire-scarred lands in California from last year alone. It's like we literally couldn't make enough compost to service these lands. So it's like the demand for compost is, in my opinion, indisputable.
We also need public-private collaboration. We need distributed composting sites in green space to make them accessible and limit the transportation needed to haul around food scraps and composted soil.
My vision for Orange County, Florida, or Orlando is to make sure we have decentralized composting sites. So we're not hauling all across the county, and we're, not driving like a significant distance to tip our food waste. But, these community composting sites are usually under the threshold of needing to get permitted. So there is a benefit of having a more like centralized, large composting site. And my goal is to site that composting site on the Orange County landfill. It's already dead space essentially. And the, trucks already come in there all the time. It already smells like methane, which is a big factor if you have a composting site, is odor complaints. So, I think a kind of dual approach between community composting and the decentralized method, but also making sure that it's not universally everyone has access, because there's inevitably going to be those people who don't care. But you want to make it an opt-in program for the city's residents and commercial businesses. Well, actually, commercial is a different beast entirely, but you want to make it opt-in for the residents. So anyone who, wants a composting bin would be, it would be very easy for them. It would be a utility. And I haven't even mentioned the other side of what Portland, Oregon does, is they have a pay-as-you-throw trash system. So your trash is billed based on a variable rate based on the volume of your container. So someone with a tiny container is only paying $20 a month. Someone with a 96-gallon hog is paying like, $60 a month. So that incentivizes people to use their composting and recycling bins and divert waste from the landfill. Inevitably, you're going to get people who just don't care about composting or recycling, and they're going to like contaminate those bins with trash, use them as, additional trash cans. I would say we need to take away their bins and bill them more for their trash, because essentially it's costly to send that to the landfill and stuff.
And that brings us to our last suggestion, moving all waste to a variable cost model. Now, many cities are already deploying this with mixed results, but the intention is right, and we just need to fine-tune the systems. Economic incentives do wonders. If you want people to reduce their waste, well, make throwing it away more expensive. That can come in the form of making trash bins smaller and compost bins larger, or putting sensors in trash bins to measure weight. If you go over a certain amount, you pay for it. And if you are paying a flat rate for composting services such as O-Town, while paying a variable rate for waste, well, guess what? People will start to cut down on that 40% of food going to the landfills. $1 for every pound of food scraps. You know what I mean? Or we'll pay you 50 cents for every pound of food scraps.
Yeah, unfortunately, Unfortunately, I don't think that would ever be possible because of just the cost of collection. Even if you have like a highly dense route, a community of 100 people, and you're literally driving like 10 feet from bin to bin to do collection, unfortunately, just compost as a product is, not as highly valued as I believe it should be.
Yeah.
And that might relate to the fact a lot of farms prefer to use artificial fertilizer and synthetic fertilizer. So
Well, I guess one way to that, and this is to your point on public-private partnerships and the value of that, right, is if you're in a community that does have a variable waste cost, right, and so you are paying for your trash to be picked up, and you're paying on a variable level, not a fixed level, no matter how much trash you produce. Well, then if you are, let's say paying someone like O-Town Compost and subscriber to reduce your food scraps, you're also reducing your costs of trash pickup. So in a way, then if you have variable waste costs, then a private composter actually is helping you reduce your monthly costs.
exactly. And I hope the city of Orlando is listening right now, because their contract expires in a couple of years, and believe me, it's not easy going from a fixed trash collection system to a variable. I've heard it's a nightmare for like the director of solid waste or the DPW guys, but it's just like, it's the way to go. Like any economist will tell you, there needs to be incentives in place.
That's all for this episode. Big thanks to Lauren, Dr. Lee, and Charlie for the work they do and for contributing to this episode. Oh, I'm sorry. Big thanks to the marvelous soil maven, the farm dinner, and Dr. O. I seriously hope they take on these alter egos. I've actually already convinced Dr. Lee. Okay, I'm just using the name he gave himself, but it's too good to pass up. Get out there and start composting. We've included some videos to help you get started in the podcast notes if you want to try on your own. If you can't, find out if your local city or neighborhood has a service or community compost center. If they don't, maybe start one. Take a look at Farrah Zero for some inspiration on how to build community composting, and O-Town if you really want to get ambitious and start your own compost business. We'll link to both in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, thank you for supporting Animalia and all the wonderful life on this podcast.